welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving deep into source material concerning comprehensive mass deportation policies. It's a subject that really forces us to grapple with some profound questions, not just about legality, but about the pure logistical possibility of execution. We're discussing the colossal logistical, legal, and economic implications of attempting to remove, well, millions of people rapidly from the country.
And the tension at the heart of this material is, it's quite clear, isn't it? On one side, you have this immense, almost historic scope of presidential authority, seemingly designed for rapid action. And on the other side, we face the brute realities of economics, massive societal friction, and just the sheer bureaucratic scale involved.
Exactly. The core question we really need to address today is this. Does the availability of these expansive presidential emergency powers, which the source material explicitly highlights, does that fundamentally guarantee the feasibility of executing a large-scale mass deportation? Or are the inherent economic, social, and logistical costs simply so massive, so overwhelming, that they render the entire policy functionally impossible?
Well, I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely acknowledge the theoretical existence of this extraordinary legal authority you mentioned, I argue that the overwhelming projected economic costs, the necessary societal restructuring, and the, frankly, guaranteed legal resistance will inevitably paralyze implementation. The sheer scale of the challenge, I think, overcomes the scale of the power, making the policy structurally unsustainable in practice.
I see why you'd think that, focusing on those friction points. However, my perspective today is centered pretty strictly on the mechanisms and the executive capacity detailed in the source material for implementing this policy. These plans, as outlined, seem to view costs and short-term disruption as, well, secondary consequences to achieving the stated objective of comprehensive enforcement. The capacity exists potentially, if the political will sustains it. So, let's begin with that capacity argument, because it really is founded on the rapid implementation of specific laws. The legal framework for this kind of rapid execution is arguably robust precisely because it relies on existing, if rarely used, emergency statutes. The material explicitly cites presidential emergency powers, specifically the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and the Insurrection Act of 1807.
Right. And just to clarify for our listeners, these are, 18th and 19th century acts. They essentially allow the executive branch to swiftly deploy federal resources, including military assets, and potentially bypass typical peacetime due process. That's the theory anyway.
Yes, and this deployment of military assets, alongside the potential suspension of normal legal timelines, it instantly shifts the operational paradigm. It moves it from what would normally be a slow, administrative process to something more like a structured, enforcement-driven maneuver. These acts are indeed potent instruments of executive power, historically speaking, but beyond those broad legal tools, the logistical plans detailed in the material attempt to address the scale problem through the intended elimination of typical legal friction points. The plans call for removing traditional legal protections. Specifically, we are talking about implementing widespread warrantless raids and, critically, removing the sensitive location restrictions, places like schools, medical centers, churches. These measures are explicitly designed to accelerate removal proceedings and neutralize the constant legal slowdowns we typically see, which often happen when enforcement agents have to respect these protected spaces.
Okay, I acknowledge the theoretical existence of those emergency powers, and I understand the audacious nature of the plans to bypass legal friction points. However, I have to frame them against the practical reality of modern America and, importantly, a complex, deeply interconnected economy.
And what is that reality as you see it impacting feasibility?
Well, the economic disruption alone looks potentially catastrophic. The material forecasts absolutely massive federal spending. We're talking ranges from a low estimate of, $315 billion to an upper estimate of possibly $1 trillion over a single decade. Just for context, $1 trillion is roughly the entire annual budget of the Department of Defense. This staggering cost alone, before a single individual is successfully removed and sustained elsewhere, it seems like a crippling obstacle to sustained implementation. Which political system, really, regardless of its stance on immigration, can actually sustain a $1 trillion commitment to a purely enforcement action like this. It's not just the initial spend, it's the sustained budgetary commitment required to build and staff the necessary detention infrastructure, fund the international removal logistics. It goes on and on. And additionally, and perhaps even more paralyzing, are the immediate labor market effects. The source material itself includes documented warnings from business owners about severe workforce disruptions across key sectors: agriculture, construction, hospitality, you name it. So when you combine immense, sustained federal expenditure, which itself carries risks like inflation and debt, with a profound shock to critical sectors of the economy, the policy just starts to look economically unsustainable almost immediately. The cost of implementation begins to vastly outweigh any perceived benefit of the enforcement action itself.
That's an interesting and critical point, emphasizing the economic drag. I grant you that. However, I want to frame the operational structure against your concern regarding unmanageable scale. I'd argue that the intended deployment of military resources, coupled with the executive ability to potentially eliminate due process and restrictions on sensitive locations, could override the complexity of scale. It attempts to turn what would normally be a sprawling societal challenge into something more like a structured, military-style collection operation. It's fundamentally about maximizing capacity utilization under this framework.
See, that's where I really have to push back strongly. I just don't buy that deploying troops fundamentally solves the core logistical problem, which is processing millions of people. Yes, deploying troops can secure borders, execute raids, provide transport security, absolutely. But it doesn't magically create the massive, specialized bureaucratic infrastructure needed for individualized processing.
What specifically are you referring to when you say bureaucratic infrastructure in this context?
I mean, the whole system required for legal intake, for medical screening, for establishing chains of custody, ensuring documentation is correctly filed for international removal agreements, managing the sheer human traffic of millions of individuals through temporary holding facilities. This process requires trained personnel, not just soldiers, and massive sustained funding for administrative support. It's a huge undertaking. The operational challenge remains vast. Expanding detention camps, utilizing military bases, these require immense bureaucratic effort. And critically, when you factor in the inevitable legal challenges that will slow proceedings down, even with a reduction of due process, the system instantly becomes clogged. The stated goal of rapid removal fails, and the system risks reverting to indefinite detention, which is precisely what triggers those catastrophic high-cost projections we discussed. $315 billion, maybe up to $1 trillion. You really can't simplify away a potential trillion-dollar administrative lift just by saying the military's involved in transport.
Well, the plan attempts to account for this, doesn't it? If the goal is rapid removal, the military is deployed primarily to handle the immediate collection and security phase, essentially creating an operational buffer. The assumption underlying the capacity plan, it seems, isn't that the U.S. government will hold everyone indefinitely, but that they can rapidly establish agreements or use existing expedited removal processes to transfer people to their countries of origin quickly, thereby bypassing the full, lengthy court system for many.
But even expedited processes require paperwork, require legal review, however minimal. And let's press harder on that economic limit, because this, I think, is where the policy hits a wall, regardless of legal maneuvering. How, practically speaking, can the political system sustain that projected expense while simultaneously absorbing documented, immediate labor market paralysis? We are talking about critical supply chains potentially breaking down, agricultural harvests failing, construction projects stopping. This collision of massive public spending and crippling economic disruption suggests the policy is politically and financially unviable, regardless of the executive's legal authority to start it.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because you seem to be treating the economic cost as a purely rational, static variable, something existing outside of political rhetoric. I would frame the economic cost as potentially a political decision driven by a specific narrative.
Okay.
While I fully acknowledge the documented warnings from business owners about workforce disruption, those are serious. The strategy identified in the source material appears to be the successful framing of migration as an existential national invasion.
That's powerful rhetoric, absolutely, but does rhetoric pay the $1 trillion bill?
Well, It arguably weaponizes the anti-immigrant sentiment sufficiently to justify the expense, at least politically, and push back against those traditional economic objections. The argument then shifts, doesn't it? It moves from one of pure cost-benefit analysis to one of national security overriding temporary economic turbulence. The political calculation becomes the perceived threat requires this expense, and therefore the political necessity trumps the quarterly earnings of businesses, and maybe even sustain market stability. The executive capacity is sustained in this view by the political framing.
But the economic turbulence likely wouldn't be temporary. It could be crippling and sustained, forcing politicians perhaps to pivot mid-operation when voters start feeling the impact directly, in grocery stores and at the gas pump. And speaking of turbulence, we really must address the human element, family separation, and the profound societal stability costs. This brings us right back to the legal friction point.
From the perspective of strict enforcement and capacity planning, as presented in the materials, the plans focusing on systemic family separation are presented almost as a necessary, albeit harsh, consequence of establishing strict enforcement. This harshness seems intended specifically as a deterrence mechanism against future unauthorized entry. It's positioned as a calculated lever within the overall capacity model, designed to reduce future flow, thereby making the overall operation more manageable over time.
That is a compelling argument, I suppose, rooted in deterrence theory. But have you considered the counter effects on the entire judicial and logistical system? These policies, the systemic family separation, the widespread warrantless raids, and specifically removing sensitive location protections for schools and churches, they create unquantifiable but, I would argue, severe societal strain.
Why is that strain operationally relevant to the debate on feasibility, though? It sounds more like a social cost, not necessarily a logistical failure point.
But I think it's potentially the greatest logistical failure point. This severe strain doesn't just intimidate opposition into silence. It fuels highly organized legal battles and widespread community resistance. When democratic norms are perceived to be destabilized by these actions, when the state is raiding churches, separating families, the logistical challenges are met with highly organized and often effective legal opposition that actively works to slow proceedings down to a crawl.
You generate thousands of pro bono lawyers focusing on every single potential procedural slip-up. You might see mass public disobedience, sanctuaries forming. The courts, even under intense political pressure, become a constant choke point, ensuring that the initial goal of rapid removal becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to meet at scale. In effect, the societal consequence of the policy becomes its operational undoing by clogging the very system designed for rapid execution.
So your argument boils down to this. The political decision to prioritize security through radical enforcement generates so much internal friction that it ultimately exhausts the, say, $1 trillion budget without actually achieving the stated goal of mass removal.
Precisely. We have to return to the crucial difference between legal authorization and operational viability. The legal authorization, the Insurrection Act, the Alien Enemies Act, it allows you to start the engine, so to speak, but the sheer size of the required lift, the inevitable labor shortage, the societal resistance, they act like a massive, constantly dragging anchor. The machine simply can't move at the speed required to meet the goal before it burns through its fuel and potentially crashes the system supporting it.
I maintain, though, that the source material outlines clear executive tools and logistical plans that provide the capacity for execution. The existence of these broad emergency powers, the plans to remove due process restrictions, they confirm that the government can initiate the action and likely sustain it logistically for a finite time, perhaps long enough to achieve a critical mass of removals and establish that deterrence factor we mentioned. The debate, therefore, might center less on this raw capacity and more on the willingness of the political system to absorb profound, documented collateral consequences, both economic and social, for what might be a temporary gain.
And I would reiterate that while the powers exist on paper, that theoretical capacity is, I believe, overwhelmed by the practical reality. The sheer collision of astronomical projected cost, that non-negotiable potential $1 trillion figure, the documented crippling workforce failure, and the constant, sustained legal and social resistance. It renders the full scope of the policy effectively infeasible and unsustainable over the required timeline.
It's not really about the will to start, but perhaps the fundamental inability to finish without collapsing vital parts of the economy and society, which likely forces a political retreat eventually.
While this source material certainly illustrates this profound tension between theoretical legal capacity, the idea that a president can simply order this, and the very tangible challenges of scale, cost, and consequence. It seems we must always dissect the limitations and the true costs involved when we consider such unprecedented policies.
That tension between political ambition and logistical reality is absolutely undeniable. Thank you for this necessary challenge to the notion of perhaps unfettered executive capacity.
And thank you. We hope this discussion has illuminated some of the deep complexities behind these policies, showing that the legal authority to act doesn't necessarily translate easily into the logistical and economic feasibility of sustained large-scale action. We appreciate you joining us on the debate.